Welcome to the Stockout. This is your show at FreightWaves for everything related to the CPG and retail industries. I'm your host for today, Mike Baudendistel, head of intermodal and drayage at FreightWaves Sonar, the data part of the product. And I think Grace is not going to be able to join today. So this episode might not be quite as good, but I think I'm going to keep it very timely and talk about what the election might mean for companies in the CPG and retail industries. I'll go through a number of the issues that those companies are watching closely, and then I'll say who I think those industries would be voting for based solely on issues like tariffs, the food industry regulations, taxes, et cetera. So hopefully that'll be a fun one for people to listen to. And before I do that, I wanted to make sure everyone has a chance to sign up for the Stockout newsletter, which is available at www.freightwaves.com/the Stockout. Send that out every Wednesday at 2 o'clock Eastern time. And also want to thank our sponsor for today's show, which is Nikola. Discover the future of transportation today. Visit Nikola's website to explore their zero-emission Class 8 trucks. Transform your fleet and lead the charge in sustainable logistics. For more, visit nicolamotor.com. So go ahead and check that out. Big thanks to Nikola for sponsoring the show. That was interesting. Maybe you want to get in front of companies in the retail and CPG industry, which I think is a great way to lower their carbon footprint and be more sustainable. Also want to make sure everyone has an opportunity to register for the conference, which is going to be November 19th through 21st in Chattanooga, Tennessee. If you want to join us for that, just go to the site and you can use a discount code F3Stockout24. You can get a discounted rate there, and really great opportunity to network and find out what's happening in the freight transportation industry. A lot of industry experts. We're going to be announcing some new data sets as we typically do. So I'll be up on stage talking about those things. So with those out of the way, I want to get to today's content, which is everything to do with the election and various issues. So the first issue that I think is on everyone's mind is tariffs. Zach Strickland and Craig Fuller and Tony Mulvey talked about this on Thursday of last week in the State of Freight. Kind of the key issues here is Trump says he will impose a 60% tariff on Chinese imports and then impose a 10% tariff on all other imports. And the Tax Foundation says it would raise tariffs, the average tariff to 17.7%. That's going to be the highest since about the 1930s, when tariffs were just much more commonplace than they are today. And most people that are experts in this area think that this could be done fairly quickly. It's not something that would have to be approved by Congress if Trump used the Section 232, which can be used broadly for tariffs, or what's called the Section 301, which would be aimed at the trade practices it considers unfair. So that the Section 301 could pertain to China. And the way it could be deemed unfair was kind of the subsidy and domination practices that China is employing, possibly also the human rights abuses that China has been alleged of by the U.S. Department of State. So they could use those two sections to sort of get these tariffs in place pretty quickly. And there's been a lot of back and forth on this from various trade groups. The Yale lab, I saw this was quoted in an article. This was staffed by some former Biden administration economic and tax advisors. Say it would initially raise consumer prices by 1% to 5%. That's about 7 months of normal inflation. And so there's debate about whether this is in the good long-term interest of the U.S. economy. But I think in the short term, I think most people are on the same page that this is going to cause inflation in consumer products. This is an article that we have up on the screen that was written by the NRF, the National Retail Federation. Now, the National Retail Federation has really come out strongly against tariffs. Talking about tariffs as being just a tax on everyone. Sort of to talk about it being a tax, really it's a tax on the U.S. companies that are doing the importing. It's not so much a tax on China is an argument they make. So they've been very critical of what Trump has outlined. They've also been very critical of Biden for not reversing the tariffs that Trump had put in place, and by adding new tariffs. Now, the new tariffs that Biden added were pretty targeted to specific industries. Most of those are outside of retail. But they do have this quote, which from National Retail Federation, and they quote, "We need new free trade agreements that focus on both market access and tariff reductions. And we need Congress to pass a long-standing trade preference program, which remain expired. So they want free trade. They said this hurts lower income consumers the most. I think that's a fair point. They said this is paid by U.S. businesses, passed on to consumers. They also put out their own number for how much this would hurt the average household. They say it's about a $1,700 annual cost to middle income households each year, just based on the higher prices that they would assume given the tariffs. And some of the examples they gave in that article was, small business owner that has, signs they need to put up, and they have higher costs for the aluminum that they need for the signs. And there's also the potential for retaliatory tariffs that China would impose on the U.S. And then you sort of think through, well, what sectors are those that we heavily export to China? And it's a lot of soybeans that get exported out through the Pacific Northwest that are grown in the center part of the country. A lot of that's moved by rail. And then we also export pork, but a lot of the soybeans goes into animal feed that gets sent to China. So China relies on the U.S. for a lot of its food. They have pork, and a lot of their meals rely on U.S. pretty heavily. So farmers that involved in pork or soybeans, I think, would be pretty concerned about that potential retaliatory tariff if Trump were to be elected. As far as the CPG industry is concerned, they've also put out an article that you can see up on the screen. So this is from the Consumer Brands Association. That's the industry trade association that represents the CPG industry. They were not as forceful on the tariffs as the NRF. But they do describe it as sort of trading down. And this is the quote from the CBA. They say tariffs can be beneficial when used in the right circumstances, but harmful when applied without a certain due diligence. So unlike the NRF, they're not saying tariffs are universally bad. We need nothing but free trade. But they are somewhat concerned. And then the CBA also brings up a point, which is a concern of mine also, is that some of the ingredients that go into the manufactured consumer packaged goods can only be found overseas. I mean, you think about things like cocoa that goes into chocolate. Well, that's going to be grown in Africa, and kind of only Africa. I mean, coffee is almost entirely imported. Palm oil, which goes into soaps and various food products and shampoos, that's mostly grown in Malaysia and in Indonesia. There's lots and lots of examples that you really can't get those ingredients without having those imports. And so it does seem like it would make the supply chain more costly for consumer packaged goods companies. Now, maybe over time, so there would be more exceptions for certain things. But that's something that no reason to think that would actually help the U.S. if there's no domestic alternative there. So that's something to keep an eye on as well. And then I think regardless of which way the election goes, it does seem to me that the de minimis exemption likely to go away. Did a show on this with Grace the other week. That's a thumbnail from the show. Our art there has a bomb or grenade with Temu and Shein on it, which those are the companies that benefit heavily from the de minimis exemption, which basically says if it's under $800 and it's to an individual, it doesn't have that import tax attached to it, which it does seem like there's bipartisan support for having that go away. It seems like it's gotten to be a little bit more of a loophole than anything. So with that, based on tariffs and tariffs alone, how would the retail and CPG industries vote? I think retail would vote for Harris, don't want the tariffs. CPG, I think a little bit split. I think they would have higher costs for some things with some ingredients, but maybe lower costs for others. I mean, you would think that restricted, if there are retaliatory tariffs, you can't export the grain, agriculture products at the same prices that are grown in the U.S. Would think that would decrease the prices of those agriculture commodities. Those are traded on global exchanges. And that would reduce the cost for some CPG items potentially. So for CPG, kind of the impact is split. They might have a little bit higher prices in stores. So maybe the consumer dollar goes a little bit less far initially. So would say CPG kind of split, retail Harris as far as tariffs are concerned. The next topic that I think is a really big one for the election is the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC. There's been a lot of speculation that if Trump is elected, that the FTC will look much different, that Lena Khan would be replaced as the head of the FTC as commissioner. Elon Musk is clearly not a fan. It said in a tweet that she'll be fired soon. That was in response to a lot of praise for her. On the left, if you haven't been following this, Lena Khan has been very critical of a lot of the mergers, has really tried to block a lot of the mega mergers, including some that are in the retail industry. Sort of lately, the Kroger Albertsons acquisition, the FTC has sued to block that acquisition. We talked about that on a recent Stockout show when we had Britton Ladd on. So the FTC has been critical of a lot of these mergers in a lot of different industries, including retail. And Lena Khan's had her law school thesis was on Amazon, and the FTC has also sued Amazon over its alleged monopoly practices and unfairly tying a lot of different parts of the business together because it's so big, alleging that it's abusing this monopoly practice to harm consumers. Read through that entire thing and sort of got the impression that maybe who the real victim of that, if Amazon was in fact doing something illegal, was really more the vendors that sell into the Amazon marketplace, because I think they make a good case that it's very difficult to sell items profitably through the Amazon marketplace, given all sort of the hoops you have to jump through to appear high on the page, and so forth. So the FTC been very critical of a lot of these big companies, but that's one I think the head of the FTC may change if Trump is elected. So as far as how the retail and CPG industries would vote based solely on the issue of the FTC, I think the larger ones, like a Kroger, like an Amazon, would favor Trump, would like to see it look a lot different. Some of the smaller ones, though, might go to Harris. I mean, they might say, well, the FTC being hard on Amazon, which is so dominant in e-commerce, maybe that's a good thing, and it helps other retailers compete on a more level playing field. So I think the retail industry might be a little split there between large companies and small companies. I think on the CPG side, there's less impact from the FTC on the CPG industry, just because for most of those product categories, a little bit more fragmented. There's not as many barriers to entry. If you had the expertise, you could start up a potato chip, company like Utz did many years ago in Baltimore. And maybe it plays a little bit more of a role in some of the CPG items that are more heavily regulated, things like personal care products, baby formula, et cetera. FTC probably would have something to say or potentially sue if, let's say, Procter & Gamble tried to acquire Kimberly-Clark. But aside from that, CPG company probably is a little less concerned about the FTC. Now, maybe they would want Harris and the FTC to stay where it is, because they would be more strict on those retailers. So I would say put CPG in the Harris camp, because they don't want Amazon to be such a dominant player at the CPG company's expense. Move on to the next topic here. Taxes, always a big topic with elections. And I think the issue within taxes that stands out the most is the issue of the tax on unrealized capital gains on people who have over $100 million in net worth. And what stands out to me is that there are CPG entrepreneurs build a company from scratch, and that company grows to that size or larger. And if that were really to be the law, now a lot of people are skeptical that there actually will be that tax on unrealized capital gains over 100 million. But if it was, in theory, you would have to value a company, before it gets sold. And sort of the one example that comes to mind is Cliff Bar, which not long ago, a year or two ago, was sold to Mondelez for $2.9 billion, started by an entrepreneur. But let's say before that company was sold, it would have been very hard to value. It. I mean, you could maybe look at comps. Would you have to hire an investment banker to give you your best assessment? Would that be binding? So it would be very difficult, I think, to actually extract an unrealized capital gains tax if it were to apply to entrepreneurs like that. But I think that things maybe something kind of an election promise that maybe won't ultimately be fulfilled. Also on taxes, Trump says he's not going to tax overtime pay. I think that's also a difficult one to monitor. where, what's actually, overtime pay versus regular pay. Would people scale back and say, well, my regular hours are 30 hours instead of 40 hours, and therefore I have more overtime, so I pay less taxes. Harris is also going to tax high income, earners more heavily, and then Trump is going to cut taxes. Seems like pretty much across the board. So I think on the CPG side, Trump, especially the entrepreneurs, business owners, would rather not have, I think, the tariff, the Harris taxes in place. So I think CPG industry on taxes would go Trump, and I would say retail also go taxes on Trump. That would just leave more money for retail spending. So I think Trump wins that one. The next topic is food regulations, which I think is maybe the sleeper issue here, and actually think this could have an impact on the outcome of the election as well. What we have up on the screen now is thumbnail from a show I did a couple weeks ago with Grace, and it was one of the better thumbnails that we've produced. Shout out to South who put that together. But food industry, is it regulated by sock puppets? And that's a sock puppet. Looks like he's eating a sandwich, maybe, whatever he's eating. And that's a reference, if you haven't been following, it's a reference to RFK Jr., Robert Fitzgerald Kennedy Jr., who described their food and drug regulators as sock puppets, which is another way to say paper tigers, just someone that's not really regulating the food industry. And so what Trump has said about food regulation is he wants to put RFK Jr. in front to lead U.S. health and food safety. And so he wants to make him kind of this broad health czar. And so the quote that Trump said at a recent rally says, I'm going to let him go wild on health. I'm going to let him go wild on food. I'm going to let him go wild on medicines. So potentially putting RFK Jr. potentially over the FDA and the USDA. Maybe he can choose who leads both of those organizations. And RFK Jr. says, the first thing I do is I'm just going to tell the cereal companies, take all the dyes out of the food. So you think about things like, is it Pop-Tarts or the cereal, can't think of the name, the Fruit Loops, which have the bright colors. A lot of those dyes are banned in other countries, and that's actually something that there's bipartisan support on. Some of the Democrats agree with that as well. Gavin Newsom trying to ban a lot of those food dyes in California. I believe they've actually banned some of the red dyes in California. And so RFK has been very critical of that, has posted some YouTube videos that just really lay into certain chemicals, certain industrial chemicals. Another quote from RFK, he says, we've got to get off of seed oils. We've got to get off of pesticide-intensive agriculture. So he's been pretty forceful on that. I have a tweet up from him where he sort of goes through the whole thing. This was a couple of days ago. So this is from RFK Jr. He says, FDA's war on public health is about to end. This includes its aggressive suppression of psychedelics, peptides, stem cells, raw milk, hyperbaric therapies, chelating compounds, ivermectin, hydrochloroquine, vitamins, clean foods, sunshine, exercise, nutraceuticals, and anything else that advances human health and can't be patented by pharma. So he's saying there's sock puppets and in the pockets of big pharma, essentially. If you work for the FDA and are part of this corrupt system, I have two messages for you. Preserve your records, number one, and two, pack your bags. So very forceful. This could be something that could really impact the CPG companies if Trump is elected. Now, if Trump is not elected, I think a lot of this is off the table. Kamala Harris says that RFK Jr. is, quote, the exact last person for that role. And then there's all this name calling. If you want to dismiss RFK Jr., they say, well, he's skeptical on vaccines, so therefore you shouldn't listen to anything he says and shouldn't take him seriously. So that's kind of the way to dismiss him. He said, they call him a conspiracy theorist. I would say he still makes a lot of good points about chemicals that we put in our food. Are we really paying attention enough to this? If we're less healthy than we were a generation ago, there's got to be something that's wrong. And so, I think this is kind of an interesting thing. I think the group that would not, want this would be the CPG industry. So I would say this would make the CPG industry enough for them to be Harris supporters. So the CPG industry, I think, over the years has really gotten to a point where they can they've taken a lot of costs out of the food supply chain, and if they had to reformulate their supply chains in order to remove, let's say, certain dyes, well, now all of a sudden they don't look as red, they don't look as yellow, they don't look as maybe appealing to children, all of those things. So those are going to add costs associated with reformulating the supply chain. It's also going to potentially reduce sales if the food looks less appetizing. I mean, the saying that you eat with your eyes, not your tongue, I think is really true. So I think the CPG companies don't want this. I think they have taken a lot of the costs out of their supply chain to the point where some of them earn pretty good margins on a lot of those name brand type foods. Probably at the expense of consumer health. Like sugar has gotten to be a big bulking agent for a lot of CPG products. So it might make our food healthier, sort of at the expense of CPG companies. And would say retail probably doesn't want this either, just because retail would be hurt by potential changes to that as well. I think that one thing that comes to mind is kind of on the cereal boxes. Those could change. So some other countries don't allow the cartoon mascots, for instance, like some of the cereal that's sold in Mexico that's targeted at children. It's the same box in Mexico that's sold in the United States, but they have this big kind of stamp over the cartoon character, essentially censoring the cartoon character because they feel that those cartoon characters would appeal, things like Tony the Tiger would appeal to children, and those are not allowed in Mexico. Some of the other things that some other countries have done have been to reduce the impulse purchases. So, in the UK, you're not allowed to have sweets and confectionery products at the checkout counter or at the end of the aisle displays, because those are associated with impulse purchases. You just kind of buy the things you need and pick those up later on. So, would say Harris is probably a supporter of or the CPG and retail industry would support Harris on do they or do they not want to overhaul the food regulations, which could potentially come down the pipeline if Trump were to be elected. So the conclusion after going through these, let's say 4 or 5 different issues is pretty mixed, but I would say on balance, I think most businesses in the CPG and retail industry, not having radical changes to the way things are regulated, probably would be the way they would go. So they might actually be Harris supporters over Trump supporters, even with Trump being largely pro business. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. But I think that you should also go back and listen, if you haven't seen it already, the State of Freight that Craig Fuller, Zach Strickland, and Tony Mulvey did on Thursday. And so their conclusion was that for the freight industry specifically, Trump, a second Trump term would potentially be a positive for the freight industry, and potentially a big one, because would have lower taxes, and the lower taxes would lead to more consumption. More consumption would lead to more freight, and then that would really get the freight economy going. So would encourage you to go and do that. And with that, I want to just make sure everyone also knows how to sign up for the Stockout newsletter. You do that at www.freightwaves.com /the Stockout. Plan to send that out on Wednesday. We'll go through a few of the earnings reports, which I think are still a little bit lackluster for the freight companies. But they're starting to, when they talk about forward-looking, I'm going to say guidance, but the forward-looking expectations for 2025. More freight companies are talking about rates rising. So in JB Hunt and Hub Group on the intermodal side, we've talked about the rate environment. They think it's bottomed here. They think the rates are going to start to rise once those rates fully roll over. Also heard some positive comments by Werner, Derek Leathers at Werner, suggesting that the freight industry is turning. We do see a little bit of that in our data. And I think there's reasons to be optimistic on 2025. I mean, whoever wins the election, that person's built up a lot of political capital and are likely to spend it. That's going to really drive a lot of demand. Meanwhile, the capacity should slowly trickle out of the transportation industry. So I think most of FreightWaves is pretty bullish on 2025. And with that, hope everyone has a good week.